Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight we're venturing deep into the heart of Texas, where the land is as vast as its legends, and just as terrifying. From eerie lights haunting dark rivers to ancient forces that never should have been disturbed, get ready for 5 of the most disturbing true Texas horror stories that will make you question what's real and what's lurking just beyond the horizon. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing, and by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's just the beginning, and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here, the night is only getting started, and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now let's dive into the darkness. Langtree, Texas, near the borderlands. That which is dead does not lie silent. It listens, it waits, it remembers how to feel. I never meant to stay in Langtree for more than a few days, just long enough to document the limestone outcrops that dotted the Rio Grande borderlands, forgotten remnants of a seabed older than sin. I was a geologist, nothing more. I had no belief in ghosts, gods, or the strange murmurings of locals who swore the land remembered blood. Langtree was a dying town, sunburnt and rotting. One saloon, 2 gas pumps, a courthouse that used to be a bar. The ghost of Judge Roy Bean still hung heavy over the place, like a scent no breeze could carry away. I stayed at a rundown ranch house belonging to an old widow named Maureen. She didn't talk much. She warned me not to go poking around the bluffs near the Devil's Wash. That land breathes, she said, and breathin' things ain't always alive in ways you'd understand. I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. It started with the hide. I found it on the 3rd day while scraping at a sun-bleached rock face that looked, to my trained eye, out of place, rounded and smooth in a way that didn't match the surrounding sediment. It felt wrong, hollow, warm, almost. I dug carefully, brushing away layers of dust and stone until something beneath shone like polished leather. It looked like fossilized skin, thick, tanned, tightly stretched across something unseen, but it wasn't brittle. No, it moved. When my gloved hand brushed its surface, it shivered. I recoiled. My heart kicked up like a dying engine. My breath came fast, like I'd just been sucker punched. The air around the bluff suddenly stank of salt and copper. I could swear the wind stopped blowing, just for a moment. I should have left it buried. Instead, I marked the coordinates, took photos, and made plans to return with proper tools. I thought it was a massive preserved hide, some prehistoric megafauna maybe. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a relic of Earth. It wasn't dead. That night, the town changed. At first, it was just sounds, low thumps in the earth like distant drums. Then the flapping, rhythmic, wet, like sails in a storm. Then came the pulsing under the floorboards, like something massive was breathing beneath the ground. Maureen heard it too. She banged on my door around 2 a.m., pale as the moon, her eyes darting. "You touched it, didn't you?" she whispered. "The thing in the bluff." I nodded dumbly. My throat was dry. "You fed it," she said. "Now it's stretching again, trying to remember its shape." The next morning, the dogs were gone. All of them. Every mutt, stray, and coyote from 20 miles out had vanished. What we did find was worse. Near the bluff on the sandbank of Devil's Wash were skins, empty, intact, peeled as if by careful hands. No blood, no bones, just raw, fleshy suits laid flat across the earth. But the worst part? They were arranged. Spirals, symbols, loops inside loops, a kind of alphabet the mind instinctively rejected, shapes that didn't belong in our world. I tried to photograph them. The camera glitched, then died. When I looked directly at the patterns, they seemed to move, not physically but perceptually. They bled into my thoughts like a whisper I couldn't unhear. On the 5th day, the wind changed. It came from underground, hot and wet. Carries a smell like birth, blood, salt, and something older. I returned to the bluff at sunset, and the hide was now visibly moving, rising, falling, breathing. I saw it then, not a fossil, not a relic, a membrane. Something was growing beneath it, waking up, remembering itself. It wasn't flesh like ours. It had no bone, no spine, no face. But it learned. It stretched and mimicked what it had tasted. It wore the skins of animals, of men. It studied us. I don't know how long it's been here, hundreds of years, maybe longer. But I do know this. It wasn't buried in the stone. The limestone had grown around it, like the earth tried to cover a wound, a scab forming over something unkillable. Maureen was the last to go. I found her skin on the porch, eyes still open, mouth frozen in a scream. Inside, the house was silent, but I could feel it, something watching from beneath the floorboards, something that knew I had touched it, fed it, awakened it. I write this from the saloon where Judge Bean once passed his twisted laws. It's empty now, the whole town is. Langtree has become a husk. Outside, the dirt shifts. The land rises and falls like a great lung inhaling. The air pulses with a sick rhythm, and beneath it all, I hear the flapping. Not wings, not footsteps, skin. It's moving closer. I beg you, if you ever find a hide that shouldn't be there, buried where stone should sleep, don't touch it. It remembers touch, and now it wants to wear you. Worship does not sustain the divine. It awakens what lies beneath it. Beeville, Texas, is a place whose name fades even as it's spoken. When I first arrived, I expected dry heat, abandoned storefronts, and the scent of history gone stale. But the air here had something else, a sour, sweet rot, like perfumed decay. I came as a folklorist, chasing the dying embers of oral tradition. The job was simple enough. Record what remained of the local stories, Catholic death rites, whispers of missions long collapsed into the weeds. I didn't expect to find the ruin that locals wouldn't name. The Mission de la Muerte. Its real name lost, this crumbling Spanish mission lay 3 miles south of Beeville, smothered in mesquite and silence. Even the wind hesitated near its walls. The townsfolk called it El Silencio del Hueso, the silence of bone. But they were wrong. It was never silent. The first night I camped near the mission, I heard the wind change. It began as a breeze, then twisted into breath, low moans, dissonant and choked, like a choir gagged by centuries of dust. I recorded it on my field mic. When I played it back, there were words I hadn't heard, Latin maybe, or older. I returned the next morning to explore the ruins. The chapel had collapsed years ago, vines strangling its cracked nave. But beneath the altar I found a staircase, sealed behind a cracked slab, bearing a cross and a spiral carved into the stone. The spiral wasn't Spanish, it pulsed with age, with invitation. I should have walked away, but I didn't. The story was too good. I needed to know. The steps descended into cold, not cool, cold, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I lit a lantern and moved downwards, the walls narrowing, pressing against me like ribs. At the bottom I entered the crypt, and there it was, a choir built of bone, dozens of rib cages mounted into crude half-circles, like pews arranged around a black stone altar. Skulls lined the walls, their mouths agape. Each had holes drilled through the temples, thin sinews strung between them like nerves or threads. The remains were ancient but clean, as if something had preserved them, fed on them. The air throbbed with pressure. My ears rang, and then I heard it. No, not with my ears, with my mind. A hum, low, mournful. It shifted with my breath, echoed my heartbeat. As I moved forward, the bones began to sing. No melody, no words. Just a terrible awareness, like the moan of things too old for names. I stayed too long. Each time I stepped forward, the bones responded, vibrated to my fear, my memories, my belief. I recited a prayer aloud, an old Catholic verse I'd heard as a child. The bones screamed, not with sound, but sensation. My head split open with unseen frequencies. I dropped to my knees, weeping without knowing why. Images flooded my mind, not of God or saints, but of a thing coiled beneath the chapel, buried deep in Texas clay. Something old, something wrong. A mouth without lips. A church that had no ceiling, only skyless depth. It didn't want worship, it wanted attention, fear, reverence without understanding. I ran, but not fast enough. The town wasn't waiting for me. Beevil was listening now. The wind carried the hymn. Windows rattled in rhythm. People began murmuring prayers they didn't know in languages they'd never learned. At night, I heard bones clicking under my floorboards, soft, rehearsing. The townsfolk started walking toward the mission again, blank-eyed, muttering. I left Beevil. Or maybe I didn't. It doesn't matter. Because the choir sings now, louder each night. In every empty town, every dying church, every place that once had faith but forgot why. And in the silence after the hymn, I hear something waking in the dirt. If you find a church abandoned and buried beneath more than time, don't pray inside it. You're not praying to God. You're feeding something far, far older, and it's learning how to sing in your voice. I used to teach 7th grade science in Presidio, Texas. It was a good, quiet job, a quiet life. Nothing ever happened in Presidio, stuck out there in the desert along the Rio Grande, until the night the sky broke open and something fell through. The meteor shower was supposed to be a wonder. I had the kids build little shoebox planetariums. They'd cut holes for stars and glued foil meteors streaking across paper skies. We were going to watch it together, lying in the dust behind the school, eating tamales and giggling about space. But when the meteors came, they didn't burn orange or gold. They fell like coal and hissed like steam, and with them came the black rain. It wasn't real rain. It fell dry, more like ash, soft as powder and unnaturally uniform, covering everything in a thin gray film that shimmered like crushed beetle shells. It didn't smell like rain either. It smelled like cold iron and old blood. By morning, the world looked like it had been grayed out. The sky was overcast, the sun too weak, as if the black rain had thinned the veil between our world and something else. That's when the visions began. Rosa Perez, a sweet church-going girl, was the first to go blind. But she didn't panic. She smiled. When her parents rushed her to the school, hoping I could explain something, anything, she spoke gently, calmly. She said, "I can see now. I can finally see the city." Within 2 days, 6 more students claimed to be blind, but their behavior changed. They were serene, like sleepwalkers caught in a beautiful dream. They didn't bump into walls. They moved around things that weren't there. They whispered about shapes in the sky, spinning and shifting above us, invisible to the eye but clearer than light in their minds. They spoke of a city made of angles whose towers were bent in ways that defied gravity and reason. I called it hysteria, until it began happening to the adults. Old man Ortiz collapsed during Mass, shouting that the crucifix was bending inward like it was folding into itself. Trees in the park seemed to curve subtly, as if nudged by an invisible wind. Buildings that once stood square now felt off, like they were leaning when they weren't. I started to see it too, at first only in my dreams, but then in the mirror. My face had too many planes, my shadow bent in ways it shouldn't, and the school, the angles of the hallway didn't add up anymore. One day the West Wing had 5 classrooms. The next, it had 6, even though no one had built anything. I heard breathing inside that 6th room. Rhythmic, wet, geometric. I began keeping a journal. I wrote down the shapes my students described, hexagons that unfolded into spirals, circles with teeth, stars that rotated into themselves. But when I drew them, the ink shimmered, and then the pages began to move on their own, not with wind, but with will. One night I dreamed I was floating above Presidio, but it wasn't Presidio anymore. The streets were fractals, the houses woven from pulsing triangles. Above it all, the city in the sky loomed, a cathedral of impossible geometry whose spires pierced the fabric of space itself. I woke up crying black tears. The next morning, the rain started again. By the end of the week, Presidio was gone. I don't mean destroyed, I mean rewritten. Those of us who remained couldn't leave. Roads looped into themselves, GPS failed. The desert turned to liquid math. Trees hummed in frequencies I felt in my teeth, and in the heart of it all stood the school, now taller, stranger, shifting by the hour. I don't teach anymore, I listen. The city above speaks in angles now. It doesn't need a mouth, and I understand it better than I understand my own name. They say the black rain came from a meteor, but I know better. It was no meteor, it was a message, a kind of infection, not of the body, but of space, of reality. It doesn't want to kill us, it wants to convert us, to remake the world in its own image, one terrifying angle at a time. And worst of all, it's working. Fort Stockton lies in the heart of the Permian Basin, where the land is as dry as the wind that scours it. In a place so barren, so inhospitable, one would expect little to disturb the dust, yet it is here in the veins of the earth that a presence has stirred. I arrived in Fort Stockton to study the drilling rigs. I was a geologist, a man who dealt in facts, measurements, and numbers. No nonsense. But as I set foot in the shadow of the rigs that loomed over the oil fields, like grotesque sentinels, I could feel something unsettling beneath my feet. It wasn't the smell of oil or the hum of machinery. It was something older, something watching. The men in the field had already begun their work on the new well, a deeper venture into the shale than anyone had dared before. They were drilling into the earth where the geological layers thickened, where the rock was said to be impenetrable, untouched since the earliest epochs of the world. The first reports of the strange occurrence came on the 3rd day. The drillers had struck something, a rupture beneath the earth, but not just any fracture. When the drill hit, the ground shuddered, as if something massive was turning over in its sleep. And then it began to vent heat as if a volcano had opened beneath their feet. But the heat was not natural. It pulsed, beat-like, rhythmic, a constant, insistent thrum like a living thing breathed beneath the rock. The men gathered around the well as the drill continued its endless grind into the abyss. They were sweating, eyes wide, terror mingling with awe as the heat intensified. I had never seen anything like it. And then, the glow. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the sun on the exposed oil. But as the minutes passed, the light grew, shifted. It was not the orange of fire. No, this was blue, a strange, unnatural azure that made the shadows stretch and the air shimmer. The workers whispered. Some even prayed in a language they didn't know. One of the older men, Carl Glover, began drawing spirals on his arms with his own blood, muttering something about a god beneath the shale. I asked him what he meant, but he only gazed at the ground as though he could hear something beneath the earth. His face was pale and his eyes were wide, glazed over with the look of a man who had glimpsed something he could not understand. And as if on cue, the heartbeat, that terrible pulse, grew louder. By the 5th day, the crew had lost their grip on sanity. Joe Green, the foreman, had always been a steady man, calm and calculating, but on the night of the 4th, he stood on the edge of the rig, staring into the darkness as though drawn to it. When I tried to speak to him, he only smiled, a wide, frenzied grin that chilled me to the bone, and said, "Can't you hear it, doctor? It's calling." He had begun carving the same spirals that Carl had, on his hands, his face, his legs. His movements were not his own anymore. They were the movements of a man possessed by something from deep within the earth. By the time I gathered my bearings and descended into the pit to investigate, I found the crew huddled together in a half-dazed stupor, their eyes glazed and their lips whispering the same frantic prayer. None of them would look at the well. None of them would acknowledge the thing beneath it. But I saw it. As I stood by the edge, my own mind beginning to slip, I looked into the depths, and I felt it. A pulsing, molten force that thrummed from within the earth like a heart beating in a vast, empty chest. I saw something that was not rock, nor oil, nor anything of this world. A vast, liquid mass of plasma, blackened with the soot of millennia, swirling beneath layers of shale and stone. And within it, I saw something else, a shape, a form, not quite humanoid, but alive, pressing against the very boundaries of reality itself. A being, one that bled fire and whose pulse matched the rhythm of time itself. The drilling continued, though I begged them to stop. I begged them to seal the well, to abandon the field entirely. But the compulsion, the madness, had already taken hold of them. Each hour that passed, the heart of the earth seemed to beat louder, faster, until the entire field began to vibrate. The final day came, when the heartbeat grew deafening. We were standing at the edge of the well when it happened. The drill had descended far too deep. It was no longer just heat, it was fire, and the air itself tore with an impossible roar. And then the ground gave way. A fire erupted from the well, blue and molten, and with it came a wave of heat, so intense that even the strongest of men crumpled to their knees. And then I saw it, a mouth. No, not a mouth, a fissure, a rift that had been sleeping, dormant beneath the earth for eons, waiting for the right moment to wake. From it poured the very essence of the thing that had bled fire, its form unclear, shifting like molten stars barely held together by the thin veil of reality. A mouth. No, not a mouth, a fissure, a rift that had been sleeping, dormant beneath the earth for eons, waiting for the right moment to wake. From it poured the very essence of the thing that had bled fire, its form unclear, shifting like molten stars barely held together by the thin veil of reality. The men screamed, their bodies igniting in an instant, consumed by the fire that was not fire at all, but the very heartbeat of an ancient god that had slumbered beneath the shale since before the earth had formed. I have been the only one to return, though I wish I had not. I feel it still, the beat, the pulse. It is still there beneath the earth. And though the world goes on, I can hear it. The beat that never stops. The thing that was never meant to be found. Fort Stockton will not recover. The land will swallow the memory of it, but I know better. The thing that bled fire still waits. It sleeps, but it dreams. And its dreams are far older than time itself. Wichita Falls was dying. That much was clear from the moment I arrived. The heat was oppressive, the sun an unblinking eye that scorched the earth day and night, until the land itself seemed to dry and crack. The wells that dotted the town, once sources of life, had become little more than dried relics of a forgotten time. It was a summer that no one would forget, but there was something I could not shake, a sense that the land was far older than it appeared. There were whispers, though hushed, that old wells, ancient wells from a time before the settlers had come, had begun to bubble in the oppressive heat. I had no interest in local folklore when I first came to Wichita Falls. I had retired from geology years ago, my hands now more accustomed to the warmth of books than the cool grip of a rock hammer. But the sudden resurgence of those old wells, bubbling to the surface with water that had long been dormant, intrigued me. There was something wrong about it. At first, the water was clear, shimmering even under the fierce sunlight. The townspeople, thirsty from the endless heat wave, drank greedily from the wells, hardly thinking about where the water came from. But soon they began to speak of visions, strange, incomprehensible images that seemed to fill their minds after drinking the water. Some spoke of seeing eyes that watched them from the depths. Others saw vast subterranean landscapes teeming with forms too alien to describe. Still others claimed that their dreams were filled with whispered voices speaking of things that lived below the earth. And then they vanished. It started with one man, a farmer named Harold Pendergrast. He had lived in Wichita Falls his whole life and, like many of the older folk, had always believed that the wells had some connection to the land's ancient history. After drinking from the water one evening, he went missing. His wife, in desperation, tried to locate him, but the search turned up nothing but the faintest trace of footprints leading toward one of the wells. After Harold, more followed. Neighbors, relatives, even strangers passing through town, all of them without a trace. The authorities were helpless, dismissing the disappearances as heat-induced insanity or sunstroke. But I knew better. I had seen enough in my studies to recognize the signs. This was no simple thirst-driven madness. The wells were active and something far older than our understanding was awakening. My obsession began when I decided to map the town's wells. I had no scientific proof, only instinct, but I was certain of one thing. There was a pattern to the locations. The wells formed a perfect spiral, a shape that was far too deliberate to be the result of chance. I spent weeks tracing the paths, visiting each well, measuring the distance between them. And as I worked, the visions began to invade me too. They came softly at first, barely perceptible, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a whisper in my ear that I could not explain. The deeper I ventured into the spiral, the clearer the hallucinations became. I saw eyes that didn't belong to any living creature, staring at me from the depths of the wells. They blinked and followed my every movement, their gaze unblinking, as though watching me for far longer than I had been alive. At first, I dismissed these as tricks of the mind, heat, exhaustion, too much time in the sun. But then I discovered the sinkhole. At the very center of the spiral, deep beneath the ground, there was a sinkhole, an ancient chasm that seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmical energy. It was no ordinary geological feature. The edges of the hole were lined with the skeletal remains of creatures long dead, their bones arranged in patterns that seemed to form words, ancient, forgotten words that chilled me to the bone. I peered into the depths of the sinkhole, my heart hammering in my chest, and I felt it, the presence, something immense and unfathomable, watching from the abyss. It was not just a feeling. It was a knowing. Something lived down there, far older than the earth itself. A race of beings who had watched the world grow above them, slumbering beneath the crust, until the day when they would rise again. They were linked to the wells, their eyes peering through the thin veil of water. Their consciousness bled through into the minds of those who drank from the wells, the Watchers, as they had been called in the old texts. And I could see them, eyes, countless eyes, each one affixed to a body made of something that was not flesh, something more ancient. They watched the townspeople, feeding on their fear, their worship, and their thirst. I knew now that they were not interested in the living. They were waiting for something. The final night of my investigation, I drank from one of the wells. I had no choice. I had to understand. The water was cool at first, then warm as it settled in my mouth, swirling like something not quite liquid, something alive. The visions came immediately. I was standing in the middle of a vast, endless plain, endless except for the wells, stretching out in all directions. And there, beneath the wells, in the shadows of their depths, I saw it. I saw them, the watchers. Too many eyes, too many shapes shifting and writhing in the dark. They did not want to kill us, nor consume us. They were feeding on something else, our minds, our thoughts, our very souls, perhaps, as we gazed into the depths. I knew then that this was the price of the wells, the minds of the living offering themselves willingly or unwillingly to the eyes beneath. I fled Wichita Falls, my mind unraveling, but I knew better than to believe it was over. It was never over. They would wait, as they had for millennia, for another soul to drink from the wells, and the spiral would continue until the last of us had vanished.